What's happened to America's middle class? After decades of declines in salaries, living standards, are they now America's working class? Growing numbers of Americans are veering toward a form of political extremism, or maybe they're just rebelling against the status quo. The rise of Donald Trump is another sign of the fall of the United States middle class. This is the MoneyMakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, if we look at that rise in the Trump stock and we look at it as a result of the middle class in America, then we've got to say what's happening in South Africa when you look at Julius Malema's rise, what's happening in the United Kingdom when you see the rise of Jeremy Corbyn on the left of the Labour Party. To join us for this discussion via Skype is the Chief Economist at STA Wealth Management, Worth W. Wray, on the line to us from the United States. In studio, I've got Nerina Visser, who's an ETF strategist and advisor, and Mohammed Nalla, who's the head of strategic research at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. Is Worth W. Wray, let's start with you. Is Donald Trump the Republicans' Republican?
I'm afraid if he's a Republican, then I'm not. But you know, Trump is something that I would expect in this kind of economic environment. The middle class is getting hollowed out. You know, our economy has been shaky, and the things that we're doing to try to support it are making the rich richer by driving asset prices up, while globalization and automation erode the living standards and wage bases for most Americans. So it's natural that they would, shift toward candidates like Donald Trump, like Bernie Sanders. It's this reach to vote out the establishment and try to do something new. I'm afraid it doesn't lead in the direction that so many voters are hoping. But it is to be expected.
I did have to chuckle at the Canadian Prime Minister visiting Barack Obama recently, and one wonders what they talked about, whether or not we were going to see the Canadians building a wall across the Canadian-American border like Donald Trump plans to do in the South, just to keep Americans in rather than in Canada.
It's certainly possible. What worries me about the entire idea of building a wall is I'm not sure if it's to keep Mexican workers out or at some point Americans in, and it's not something that I'd like to see. The election of a man like Donald Trump is alarming, and it's concerning because we really do not know who he is. The man has been running on hyperbole, so he may get into office, and I think that he may get into office and become an incredible reformer and exactly what this country needs to deal with special interest groups and get money out of politics. It sounds great. The problem is he may also end up being a fascist who ends up eroding significantly the constitutional foundation of a country that I love. And so we are staring down the barrel of a gun here, and it does concern me.
It's probably Hillary Clinton's best chance at an election victory in the US elections in November. But it is interesting, isn't it, Mohammed? I mean, we sit here in South Africa, we bemoan our political leadership, we bemoan the levels of corruption, and we're right to do so. But we're not alone in the world of crazy.
No, undoubtedly. I mean, Bruce, if you look at this rise of populism, it's a very disturbing global trend that you're starting to see, as you indicated in the introduction.
As an elitist in a smart shirt and tie and a very expensive suit with a lovely digital watch, you're in a very comfortable position to say so, Mohammed.
Well, the fact of the matter is that, like I said, the rise of the populism is directly as a result of a very large disenfranchised middle class in the United States. In South Africa, very large and disenfranchised lower class, if you want to call it that, the unemployed or the unemployable in South Africa. Now, the commonality there is that there's a disenfranchisement with the establishment, with the status quo. It's because economic conditions, not just over recent history, but heck, over the last several decades, have not been conducive to spreading the love. We've had global inequality reaching levels that are unsustainable. South Africa stands out. I think we're probably number one or number two in terms of global inequality. And the simple fact of the matter is that those scenarios are not sustainable. They lead to dislocations. If those dislocations come from a political shift, then potentially that's what we're seeing underway right now.
If economies were in better shape, Nerina, if the South African economy was in better shape, there would be less trepidation around our politics, I would argue.
Bruce, I'm not sure that a better economy would necessarily save us from the situation that we find ourselves in globally. I think this is definitely a global trend that we're experiencing. And I guess in America, it's almost their equivalent of the Arab Spring that we're seeing. What you are confronted with is people operating on emotion, on quick sort of soundbite information, and very little rationality, intellectualization, thinking about the implications of what is being proposed and so on. And I think the new minority that you have is somebody who actually thinks, somebody who's actually rational in terms of what they do. And I think what you're seeing is that the populist leaders or prospective leaders like Donald Trump, like Bernie Sanders, like Boris Johnson, like Julius Malema, like Silvio Berlusconi, the list can go on. They are playing on this emotional impact that they have. And I guess our best hope actually that we need in global politics is not the crazy politician, but actually the mad politician. Mad as in make a difference. In other words, use the populist emotion, sensationalist talk to get into power. And then if you have the right ethics, then you can actually make the necessary difference.
That's the problem Worth has. The problem Worth seems to have, and I'll come back to you in a moment, Worth, is that we just simply don't understand whether or not Donald Trump has a single principle in his being.
Well, he certainly doesn't have a track record of having principality or ethics in his being. But I'm not going to judge him. I certainly don't have enough insight in terms of that. But let's maybe bring it back home again, and let's look at somebody like the EFF, who's very effectively using Julius Malema to play this role of getting the populist vote in. But with an advocate, Dalian Porf, who sits behind it, who's got the intellectuality and the brains to think in terms of how is this going to play out. If you go and evaluate the election manifesto of the EFF, I promise you it's a lot less sensationalist than the rhetoric that we hear from Julius Malema.
Absolutely, and it is about being able to create the noise in order to destabilize the establishment. And this is an anti-establishment vote that we see happening in the United States. I mean, when one looks at Britain, for example, where Jeremy Corbyn is the opposition leader, where Boris Johnson may very well go to head-to-head with David Cameron to take on the establishment. Johnson's as establishment as they come. I look at it, Mohammed, and I go, if South Africa is ever going to face an immigration crisis, you have Vladimir Putin sitting in Russia, you have Boris Johnson sitting in England, and you have Donald Trump sitting in America. We could have a skills influx.
It's a fantastic scenario for South Africa. Yes, you see a skills influx. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it almost doesn't matter what the underlying policies are, as long as it's anti-establishment. I mean, if you look at in the UK, I think the high degree of voter apathy, if you want to call it that, with regards to whether they stay in the EU or don't stay in the EU, almost plays into the hands of the likes of a Boris Johnson, who, interestingly enough, has firmly pinned himself to that Brexit argument. And they're cheap political shots. Are they going to use that to weaken the establishment? Absolutely. It's a political game. What's more concerning for me is, as Nerina indicated, is what is the probability of, once they get across the line, of breaking the establishment and becoming the new establishment? What's the probability of sane, rational policy making thereafter? Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily think those are the same across the US or across the UK or in South Africa. I think they're differentiated probabilities there.
Well, let's get Worth W. Ray's view again. I mean, here you got Donald Trump. Let's say, for argument's sake, he does win a presidential election in November. What are the scenarios playing out in your mind, Worth, on a serious note?
My goodness, whoever wins this next election, I believe, will end up presiding over a restructuring of the global financial system, a restructuring of the global economic system. They will set the tone for the next 50 years. So you have to understand is that the U.S. middle class is the product of the Industrial Revolution, which made all of us more productive. The problem with that is that now we're entering into an automation revolution where technology is replacing workers altogether. And there's a tremendous number of workers that are going to be displaced. I think in the US, you could start seeing unemployment rates approaching the experience that you've had in South Africa. It's going to become more intense in a lot of places in the world. So what we need is a restructuring, a renegotiation of the social contract that allows for explosive productivity growth, that incentivizes innovation and entrepreneurship, but also provides a level of support, a level of training, and a way up and out for that disenfranchised worker base that's growing. And I'm afraid that if a Donald Trump comes into office, we're likely to go the other way. We're likely to see a police state tighten down and try to keep that worker base sort of at bay, that you're likely to see very negative fallout in global international relations. And I don't think it bodes well for the world or for the United States.
Okay, then let's look at another scenario where either a Bernie Sanders, if he gets the Democratic nomination, which doesn't seem that likely, or a Hillary Clinton, which is more likely. What if they end up in the White House? Does it really change the status quo that much?
If Sanders comes into power, I think that you'll see a massive expansion in the social safety net, but with very anti-business policies that will have the effect of basically squeezing off productivity growth and hurting economic growth here. So, I do think that this disenfranchised group that's voting for this anti-establishment candidates, I think they're going to get changed one way or another, like Malcolm X said, by the ballot or the bullet. So they're pushing that way, and it does concern me. If a Hillary Clinton comes into office, look, we shouldn't be talking about Hillary Clinton as a candidate for the president of the United States. We should be talking about a trial for obvious corruption. However, in her case, I think that she is an establishment vote. It is a continuation of the government that we've had for a while, and I'm afraid that may be preferable to what we get otherwise.
It's a really interesting set of scenarios. Now, for you two, paint for me the next 5 years for South Africa in a Donald Trump presidency. I'm giving you a Hillary Clinton presidency to deal with, Mohammed. A Donald Trump presidency, what is the consequence for South Africa, Nerina?
Massive influx of immigrants from the US.
Seriously now.
No, seriously, I fully agree with what Worth says. Is I think the future direction for the US becomes a lot more cloudy then, a lot more focused on internal issues, and therefore even less consideration for other markets, for emerging markets in particular. So I think the US Fed policy, for example, could be hugely influential in terms of being a negative impact for South Africa. I do think that it is a bad scenario for South Africa if Donald Trump does get into power in the US, but I do think what policies get implemented will be the determining vote at the end of the day. Okay. So it is, there are a lot of moving parts, because it's also not just about Donald Trump. It is also about what happens in the other major areas in the world, in particular in Europe. And I think Europe, with its migrant crisis, Angela Merkel coming under pressure, there's a lot of pressure on establishment politics as we see it, and I don't necessarily see the biggest danger to the anti-establishment, but it's essentially an anti-capitalist vote that is coming through, and I think it is that shift in terms of what is the alternative that I think is going to be the very interesting politics of the next 5 years.
Give me a South Africa view with Hillary in the White House.
So I think, Hillary's ties to Wall Street are still relatively strong. I would almost see that as meaning a perpetuation of the status quo for as long as they could possibly drag it out. Unfortunately, that means no real global structural reform. It means we kind of bumble along. I think on a relative basis, it's probably better for emerging markets compared to a Trump presidency. Nerina was saying that's a bad situation. I think that's the worst situation, and Hillary would probably be a bad situation for South Africa. I think emerging markets might get that reprieve, but a perpetuation of the status quo merely defers dealing with the problem to a later stage.
Well, that's what we like to do. We push it out. My thanks to Mohammed Nalla. He's the head of strategic research at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. Nerina Visser, who's an ETF strategist and advisor. And at STA Wealth Management, we've got Worth W. Wray this evening. There'll be more intriguing conversations on future Moneymakers. For now, though, sleep well if you can. Good night.